Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Lyman RoP Explainer. My name is Samas Marku. I am the USG Academics for the Lyman University Secretariat. And today I will be leading this video alongside two very good friends who will introduce themselves right away.
So my name's Alex and I'm the USG chairing for the conference.
And my name's Nadara and I'm the Secretary General of the Lyman HS Conference.
Thank you, Alex and Nadara. We'll be moving on to explain very briefly what the RoP document is. So the RoP document, can find it on our website. It has been published on the academic resources page of the Lyman website. It's quite a lengthy document. It exceeds 30 pages in length, but fear not, we are here to explain what the science in that madness is with this video today. We do encourage you to take notes as we go. And please note that an RoP summary document, which we call the RoP Pocket version, is also now available on our website. So very, very quickly, before we go into the video, we're going to go over a few keywords that are used in the world of MUN. So when we refer to the House, we mean all the delegates in the committee. When we say the dais or the chairs or the directors, it means the same thing. It means the people who are moderating debate. And finally, when we say RoP in this video for short, it will mean the rules of procedure. So it means that long document that explains what debate procedure looks like. In this video, we will cover initial stages of debate, that is roll call and setting the agenda, the general speakers list, motions, points, written documents and amendments, and finally, voting. And I will now pass you over to Alex, who will walk you through the debate process.
Fantastic, thank you, Savas. So this is what we're going to cover in the content of the video, bit by bit, of how MUN debate is structured. This is the process flowchart of how it happens. In a rough overview, there are additional elements in each of these points that we'll cover in later depth in the video. And additionally, a more detailed summary of this, a more detailed flowchart is available in the MUN RoP Pocket version that Savas referred to earlier. Can I grab the next slide? Thank you. So I'll now pass over to Nadara to cover roll call and setting the agenda in debate.
Thanks, Alex. So as you saw on the previous slide, the first thing that we begin with is roll call, and it is taken at the start of every instance where debate is resumed following a suspension. So this includes coming back from lunch breaks or when you start the second day or the third day. You declare your voting status, and this pertains to what your substantive vote is, so not necessarily for procedural votes. Everyone will vote during a procedural vote. And I think in later slides, we'll cover exactly which the substantive and procedural votes are. So Savas, if we could go on to the next slide, please. So you can take these stances in a roll call. You can either be present, which allows for abstention from substantive voting. You could be present and voting, which means you can't abstain. And for observer states, it's the same rights as member states, but you can't vote on resolutions. So this is when it comes to substantive votes after the closing of debate, you can't vote on resolutions. And there's a 2/3 majority, 2/3 of your committee needs to be present for debate to begin. So this is quorum. Setting of the agenda as well. So next slide, please, Savas. Thank you. So we at Lyman UC this year, we only have one topic for each committee, so you won't have to worry about this. Usually there would be a debate to set the agenda, so you would motion to set the agenda and debate on which agenda should be taken, topic A or topic B. But in this instance for Lyman UC, you'll just the chair will announce the topic and set the agenda to that topic. So I'll hand back over to you, Alex, now for the general speakers list.
Fantastic, thank you, Nadara. So you may be familiar with the general speakers list from previous MUN experiences, or you might not be. The general speakers list is a constantly open list of speakers, as the name suggests, that delegates can sign up to in their committee to speak as part of. And as the slide shows, It's about presenting your policy and your stance by giving 90-second speeches, although that time may vary in committee. You have the right to speak, and delegates, when you're on the speakers list, and delegates can only speak with the permission of the chair of the committee. Within the general speakers list, you have the ability to yield, and you can yield yourself to points of information, which are questions to the speaker in the remaining time available. So if that 90-second speaking time has elapsed, speakers will get 20 seconds to ask those points of information. You can yield to another delegate, although you cannot yield to the second degree. So while you're on the general speakers list, you can yield after your speech to someone else, but they can't yield to someone else after that, following on after you. You can yield back to the dais, so that returns the yield and returns the speaking time to the chairs of your committee. Every committee needs to have speakers continuously on the general speakers list. So you can send private messages to your chair to be added. If you run out of people for the general speakers list, it means that debate in your committee is effectively dried up, and we don't want to see that in any committee. That being said, you can't be in the general speakers list twice at the same time. That wouldn't make much sense. So Savas, can I have the next slide, please? We'll also consider right of reply. So you may be familiar with this in MUN. It's the ability to reply to something that another delegate has said in the course of one of their speeches or points. So when can you use that? And this is very, very closely regulated. You can use it when it insults the national integrity of the member state you're representing, or it offends a governing body or your governing body or sovereignty of the member state you're representing. Requests have to be submitted to the dais, to the chairs, in writing, along with a short explanation of the reason for your request. So if you debated at high school level, you can't just be jumping up and shouting for a right of reply. You cannot raise these rights of reply issues during normal caucuses, as other motions or rights are. When delegates are granted time to state their complaint, there can be no follow-ups to that. And the chair's decision to grant the right to reply is not open to appeal. So that will be a flat decision and then implementation, and you can't appeal that. Savas, can we grab the next slide, please? So now I'll hand back to Savas to cover motions within the Lyman RoP.
Thanks, Alex. So we'll now go into the motions. So I'll first start by defining what a motion is. So in Lyman RoP, debate is controlled by motions, and a motion is simply a proposal by a delegate for the committee to do something. So they are just proposals that control the business in the committee. Now your chair will ask you to propose motions one by one, and they will take typically 3 or 4 in each round of asking, and they will ask you to do so by using the raise hand function as part of the video platform on which we will deliver the conference. The motions will be considered in the order of disruptiveness, which we will explore on the next slide. Typically, with all motions, the chair will ask for seconds and objections, and if we have both, then we do take a procedural vote, which we will explain into more detail in a future slide. Now going into the order of disruptiveness. Disruptiveness for a motion basically means how far does it depart from the general speakers list. So you can see on this list, numbered from 1 to 10, that we've got at the bottom the least disruptive motions, the ones that are very close to the general speakers list. And at the top, we've got the motions which are furthest departures from the general speakers list. Under the Lyman RoP this year, we say that a longer motion of one type does not necessarily supersede or take priority over a shorter motion of the same type. That is, for an example, if you propose a moderated caucus for 10 minutes and another delegate comes along after you and proposes a moderated caucus for 11 minutes, that delegate's motion does not take priority over yours. Motions are considered in the order of submission. Just before we go into the motions in more detail, let's consider the types of votes that we've got under Lyman RoP. First of all, we've got the procedural votes, which control the business in the committee. So under these, each member, including observers, gets 1 vote, and a simple majority is required for all except the following motions. So closing a debate, appealing the decision of the chairs, a motion of competence of the committee, splitting the House, or consultation of the whole. These motions, of course, we will explain to more detail in future slides in this video. By contrast, a substantive vote is a vote on draft resolutions and amendments. So the actual motions that pertain to the solutions that the committee wants to propose to solve the topic at hand. So now let's take the motions with more detail. So we will now explain motions concerning debate. So from least to most disruptive, we've got the moderated caucus. The maximum time for a moderated caucus can be 20 minutes maximum, including the extensions. You need to state a topic, a total time, and the individual speaker's time. We've also got the consultation of the whole, which is an intermediate type of debate between unmoderated and moderated caucus. Delegates moderate the discussion themselves with chairs sitting on the side. This requires a 2/3 majority, and it can be entertained for up to 10 minutes. We've got the unmoderated caucus, which is a completely informal discussion between delegates. Normal rules of debate are suspended. The maximum time for this under the Lyman RoP 2021 will be 45 minutes, including the extensions. At some times, the chairs will ask you to state the general purpose for the unmoderated caucus. Finally, we've got the extension to a caucus, which you can request if you haven't had enough time to discuss all the topics that you wanted to cover. Going into more detail even into the moderated caucus, the moderated caucus is usually what most of the time will be spent doing in the committee. It is the most used form of debate. As we've said already, you need to specify a topic, a total duration, and the time for each speaker. Total time cannot exceed 20 minutes, including all the extensions. You can extend the moderated caucus by up to half of its original duration. In a moderated caucus, delegates are recognized by a chair. So in that sense, it looks a lot like the general speakers list, and they deliver a speech on a subtopic. As an example, perhaps the delegate might raise a motion for the moderated caucus on the issue of vaccine distribution if the topic the committee was discussing was a response to COVID-19. Going on further on the moderated caucus, once the speaking time elapses or the delegate has finished, the chair asks the delegate if they're open to points of information, or otherwise known as questions. This is slightly similar to the general speakers list, but there's no yielding as such. It's just an option for cross-examination. If the delegate wants to take questions, then they can answer questions for their speaking time remaining, plus half the time allowed for their speech. For example, if the original speaking time was 1 minute and the speaker used up 30 seconds, the combined time to answer all questions can be 30 seconds from the remaining time, plus 30 seconds that is stipulated as the half duration equals 1 minute. And as we've said already, delegates do not need to yield their time in a moderated caucus. Going on to the unmoderated caucus, this is used to discuss proposals informally in a block, in groups. You need to specify the total duration, a maximum duration of 45 minutes, including the extensions. You can extend an unmoderated caucus by up to its original duration. Once granted in the virtual conference we're running this year, delegates will be put in breakout rooms and allowed to discuss freely on proposals. The chairs will guide you on this, and you will be allowed to move between the breakout rooms to simulate the actual process that takes place in an in-person conference. We'll now go on to touch on the motions concerning documents very, very briefly, but Alex will touch on these in detail later. So we've got from least to most disruptive, we've got introduction of a friendly amendment, introduction of an unfriendly amendment, introducing a working paper, or introducing a draft resolution. And finally, we're going to touch on the motions concerning opening and closing of debate. We've got the motion to close debate. You might hear this in other places as the motion to move to the previous question or the motion to move to voting. At Lyman, this is the motion to close debate. This motion ends all discussions on a topic and voting and moves on to voting on a draft resolution. It requires a 2/3 majority, and if there are both seconds and objections, the chair will establish a supplementary speakers list with 2 speakers for and 2 speakers against. We also have the motion to suspend the meeting, whereby the chair will request for this motion when there needs to be a temporary halt in debate, for example, at lunch breaks or at the end of the day. And finally, we've got the motion to adjourn the meeting. This means that we end all business of the committee for the current session of Lyman. And when this motion is entertained, it means that the committee reconvenes at the next annual session of the conference. With this, I will now pass over to Nidara to cover points.
Thanks, Abbas. So the points, in a similar manner to how motions have an order, also have an order where some points supersede others and will be recognized by chairs in this particular order. So from the most to the least superseding priority of motions, you have a point of personal privilege. So this is if you have personal discomfort. This is if, for example, you can't hear a speaker or there's an internet issue if you're on Zoom. And the only reason a point should ever interrupt a speaker is if it's an audibility issue. But even then, we'd prefer if you mention it in the chat so the chair can flag it, as opposed to directly interrupt a speaker. You then have a point of order. This is if improper parliamentary procedure took place. As of UNA USA 2017, you can no longer do it for the content of a speech. So I know that there are some circuits that still allow for points of logical fallacy, for example, but that isn't entertained at Lyman. So it's raised whenever, as long as it doesn't interrupt a speaker and it's against parliamentary procedural errors. So the third point is a point of parliamentary inquiry. Obviously, we understand that this is a lot to go through and it's difficult to keep track of everything. So if ever there is a question about rules of procedure or what's going on or who's speaking, why or when, or what motion is currently occurring, you can raise a point of parliamentary inquiry to your chair. And it's again raised whenever during the period of debate, as long as it doesn't interrupt the speaker. And finally, you have a point of information to the chair. So this is questions about schedule, admin, or topic, and points of information to speakers during GSL speeches, but not moderated caucuses. With the online procedure, we'd prefer if you raise points by raising your hand on Zoom, or if you all have your videos on, then raising your hand in the video as well. I think that's it on points, so I'll pass over to Alex for written documents and amendments.
Fantastic, thank you, Nidara. So within MUN generally, but specifically within Lyman RoP, there are two particular types of document, that is working papers and resolutions. Unfortunately, a lot of delegates can conflate the two and think they're very similar. They are distinct entities, and we're going to go into why that's the case. So next slide, please, Savas. Thank you. So working papers are not official documents. They don't have to look like a resolution, which once voted on and finalized, a resolution is an official document of that committee. They facilitate debate and they still need chair approval, as in the case of a resolution. And once approved, they require a motion to introduce, as in the case of a resolution as well. That motion is the motion to introduce a working paper, and they can also be submitted by observers. So it's more of a kind of structure and outline of how debates should proceed and the points you want to seek to address than a resolution, which is a response to those points. So Savas, next slide. So moving on to draft resolutions. So in this instance, as compared to working papers, sponsors and signatories are required. So sponsors are the authors, and there can be no more than 5 for a draft resolution. And the signatories are people who just want to see it get debated. They have no other obligations. And if a panel of authors, a concept we'll cover later, is called, only the authors can speak on it. The sponsors, in that case, the signatories can't. A draft resolution has to be signed by 1/5 of the whole committee. That can include observers and sponsors. And once approved by the dais, so the chairs have to review it and approve it first, it requires a motion to introduce it into debate. That motion is the motion to introduce the draft resolution. And it will then first be read out by one of the sponsors and then subject to a procedural vote on that motion. So it's not a vote on the draft resolution itself. It's a vote on whether or not the committee wants to debate it. So moving on to another form of document, technically speaking, amendments. So amendments are proposals that delete or revise an operative but not preambulatory clause of a draft resolution. So fundamentally, in a resolution, you have the first clause at the start, the preambulatory resolutions that outline the background of the topic, and the operative clauses that do something about it. Preambulatory clauses can never and never really should be amended within the context of MUN. There's no reason to do that at all. How do you submit an amendment? So you don't require signatories to do this, but you still require the chair's approval. So that will be through Google Docs in the case of Lyman 2021. How do you structure them? So they can be in several formats, and these tend to be adding clauses, deleting clauses, or modifying clauses from the draft resolutions that have been introduced. Savas mentioned friendly and unfriendly amendments earlier, and you can likely guess what constitutes one of these in each case, in that a friendly amendment is something that the authors of the resolution, they admit they missed something out. They're very happy for you to do that. An unfriendly amendment is you are directly deleting a clause that they think is crucial or important for their resolution. So those two different kinds of amendment depend on how it's viewed by the author. So Savas, next slide, please. And look, lo and behold, I've already addressed this next slide. So going into further depth, so yeah, the friendly amendment, that would just be a motion to introduce friendly amendment. That's signed by, has to be signed by all the sponsors to indicate that they're definitely happy with it, that they're fine with it. And there can be no objections to its introduction from anybody else in the committee. You then proceed into the motion, and you have one speaker for and one speaker against its inclusion into the draft resolution, the friendly amendment that is. A substantive vote is required to include it in the draft resolution, and it can change the substance of a clause. So the distinctions between, in other circuits and in other MUN rules of procedure, you may see some different applications of friendly amendments. Usually in most other circuits I've seen, once the motion passes, it gets added into the draft resolution without debate. That is slightly different at Lyman. So there has to be, as I said, that one speaker for and one speaker against its inclusion in the draft resolution. So an unfriendly amendment. So as mentioned, you have this motion to introduce the unfriendly amendment, and anyone can submit this. And it doesn't need to be signed by the sponsors because, of course, it's going against their wishes. You can entertain seconds, and the chairs will entertain seconds and objections on unfriendly amendment motions. So it will require a second, and if it receives an objection, the motion to introduce the unfriendly amendment will require a vote itself if there's an objection to that. There will then be speakers for and against following its introduction, and a substantive vote again is required to include it in the draft resolution. So Savas, can we see the next slide, please? So when it comes to debating resolutions, I've already mentioned the panel of authors briefly earlier. So that is a kind of, the authors of a resolution can respond for a maximum of 15 minutes to any questions that other delegates may have about the resolution. That doesn't necessarily need to be content-based questions. It can be about, logical questions. It can be anything revolving around the structure and operation, really, of that resolution. And the authors themselves will moderate and answer those questions, so not the chairs in that instance. Or another great way to debate a resolution is to proceed to a moderated caucus. So again, as Savas mentioned earlier, putting forward a motion for a caucus to debate a specific resolution or debate the specific minutiae of that resolution. So those are the two kind of most predominant ways of approaching debate on a resolution. Next slide, please. So finally, definitely please read the Lyman Written Documents Guide, which is available on our website alongside all the other documents that Savas has mentioned. This will provide writing tips and formatting advice for what we want to see in terms of working papers and draft resolutions. It is worth noting at this stage that, as I mentioned, in order for the motions on these documents to be entertained, they have to be approved by a chair first. And if you're not following the formatting advice that we provide, or it significantly diverts from our writing tips, it's less likely to be approved by your chairs and by the dais in your committee. So worth reading. Next slide, please, Salmas. So now I'll hand back over to Nidara to cover voting within the Lyman RoP. Thanks, Nidara.
Thanks, Alex. So you've finished your amendments, you've finished looking and debating at all of your working papers and draft resolutions, so it's time to vote. You start by step one, a motion to close debate. This requires a 2/3 majority. So is one of the sort of very common motions that comes up that requires a 2/3 majority. Also note that the motion to close debate is the third most disruptive motion in RoP. So apart from adjourning or closing committee, this will be the motion that's voted on first. If there are objections, then a speakers list is established. So you would then have 2 speakers speaking for closure of debate and 2 speakers speaking against closure of debate. And then there would be a vote again on whether a motion, whether to close debate, again with a 2/3 majority. If we can go on to step 2, Sabas. Okay, so you've closed debate, but now you need to figure out how you're going to vote on the resolution. So there are motions that can be raised in order to modify or affect the way that you are going to approach the draft resolutions voting. So these motions include a motion to reorder draft resolutions. So you'll vote on draft resolutions in the order that they were introduced into committee and approved by the chairs. If for some reason the committee feels that we should reorder the draft resolutions vote, because obviously if a draft resolution, if there were 2 draft resolutions submitted and one doesn't get voted in, the other one sort of automatically takes over the committee, and therefore you might wish to reorder your draft resolutions. So that's one of them. The other is a motion to divide the question. Now, you might see that you've sort of seen these 2 resolutions, you think one of them is really good, but there's sort of 1 or 2 clauses that you really are unsure about. You can raise a motion to divide the question, in which case the draft resolution won't be voted on as a whole, but as different clauses or different sections. So you can divide the question as sort of 3 clauses in a section, and you kind of vote, okay, these 3 clauses versus the rest of the resolution. You can choose to vote clause by clause. This is in the way that you divide the question itself, but it's specifically useful if, for example, there was a particularly contentious amendment or clause and the committee feels that it would be beneficial in order to divide the question. The other motion is to split the House, and this requires a 2/3 majority. This means that everyone, apart from the observers, are required to vote. So there's no abstentions in this case. So everyone would be required to vote on the motion. It's specifically useful for when it's a very close call, and it would be difficult to reach the 2/3 majority unless everyone voted. And then you have a motion for a roll call vote for a specific draft resolution. In this case, you would vote through roll call, so you would see which countries are voting for what, and it would go in a specific order. If we go to the next step, Saras. So you've established how you're going to vote. Now you establish what ways you can vote. So there are 6 ways in which each individual delegate can vote. You can vote in favor, you can vote against, you can abstain. Note that if you if you said present and voting when you were originally in roll call, you do need to vote at this stage as well with the substantive vote. You can pass during a roll call vote, but note that if you pass, you then can't abstain. You must vote at the end. You can vote yes with rights and no with rights. Now, this is specifically, it's often quite rare to see this, but this is specifically in the case where, for example, the sponsor of another draft resolution or another resolution decides that actually they don't want this resolution, they're going to go with another one, or they think that their own resolution should be voted down because it's become sort of so construed now from what it originally was, or there was a specific amendment made that they feel specifically goes against the foreign policy of their country. They can vote yes with rights or no with rights. Again, this is for a roll call based vote. And typically, otherwise, the party would just abstain. Savas, if we go on to the next one. So once again, just to recap the entire structure of the MUN debate, you start with roll call, you have present, present and voting, you open up debate, you set the agenda. In the case of Lyman 2021, it'll just be the chair sets the agenda. You have your general speakers list, which as Alex explained, is non-exhaustive, it continues running and provides sort of the central spine of debate. You have your caucuses that Savas explained, with your mods, your unmods, where the debate happens, which then results in your working papers, which will be submitted to the chairs as draft resolutions, which will then eventually be debated on. You'll have friendly and unfriendly amendments. And finally, you'll close for debate, and voting will mean that a resolution passes or fails. And if we go on to the next slide, I'll pass over to Savas for final remarks.
Thank you, Nadara. And now we'll be making a few final remarks before we conclude this video. So the first thing we will discuss in this final section will be the question of appeals. So there is a limited scope to appeal some decisions by the chair under the Lyman RoP, but delegates should note that most decisions of the dais cannot be appealed. The few things that are open to appeal are the decision of the chair, whether to grant a panel of authors or not, the decision of the chair to set the speaking time on the general speakers list, and the chair's ruling on the points of order. That is, when a delegate feels that improper parliamentary procedure has been used. All other decisions of the chairs will not be open to appeal. And I will now hand over to Alex, who will talk to us about online etiquette and the dress code.
So within the online space, things will be a bit different in terms of how we usually approach etiquette and dress codes in the in-person setting for MUN, but the general kind of maxims will remain. So in terms of online specific etiquette, we're looking for delegates to all have their videos on, as you know, just so we know you're there, showing respect to speakers and to your chairs, all these kind of ideas, and have microphones on mute unless they've attained the right to speak from the dais during normal session. So just being polite to those around you. There's nothing worse when you're talking on a resolution than hearing someone, a family member, scream out someone else's microphone. So things like that, we're just looking to maintain the usual kind of decorum and respect that you would expect in a normal in-person conference. You should raise your placard by using the raise hand function on our online platform, and you should vote in the same way. And your chairs will look for that and let you know if there are any changes or, you know, if you're doing that incorrectly in the online session. Next slide, Savas. Thank you. So in terms of carrying on, as I mentioned, things are subtly different. So usually in an in-person MUN conference, most circuits approach the rule of requiring you to wear a tie and a jacket when you are addressing the committee, so to speak. That's usually done because, again, it's out of respect. It's showing respect to the rest of the committee by meeting a dress code that allows you to have a level of formality and seriousness when you approach the debate. It's not just to ensure that people all wear the same thing. In the online setting, we kind of felt that it's more, things can be a little bit more colloquial because we are all at home, everything's a little bit more relaxed, although we still expect the same levels of seriousness, as I mentioned, decorum and care within debates that you'd usually expect in an in-person debate. But as a result, the dress code is now business casual. So as I'm demonstrating now with a jumper and a shirt, this is business casual. There's no need for me to wear a jacket or a tie to meet the business casual code, although in debate I would lose my hat, I think, just to be appropriate. And there's a rough image we have that kind of explains what business casual attire could be for a woman in a committee and what it could be for a man in a committee, in that there are some subtle variations to this. So for women, you know, this could include blouses, dresses, skirts. It can include a whole variety of different things. For men, fairly simple. You should wear a shirt. So Savas, next slide, please.
Thanks, Alex. So we've now covered all of the things that we wanted to cover. For our delegates who are part of those committees which have special rules of procedure, you can find mention of this on our website the committee page will say that the committee has special rules. For these delegates, we encourage you to go read the RoP document, as this will list the special rules that apply to your committee. Our committees which have special rules are our security councils, that is the Security Council and the Historical Security Council, the Group of 20, the World Health Organization, and the League of Nations. You need to consult the RoP document on our website, or alternatively, you can direct your questions to your chairs or us. And finally, we'd like to go over the next steps after you've watched this video. You can read the full RoP document on our website, or if you don't have the time, you can read the RoP summary document, which also offers a handy table listing all the motions and the majorities required for them to be entertained. Of course, we'd like to draw your attention to our training session on Friday, March 19th at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, GMT, where we will be going over the whole MUN process, that is preparation, debates, how to form alliances, how to debate, how to vote, how to form your policy. And finally, we've also got our academic Q&A session on Wednesday, March 24th at 3:30 p.m. GMT, where you can come along and ask us any question about the Limon academic process. That is on RoP, on debates, on topics, study guides, or position papers. So with this, we've come to the end of this video. Thank you for watching, and see you all at our training sessions and of course, the conference weekend. Thank you very much.